Hi guys, today we are going to take an in-depth look at one of the most essential hooks in React, useState. Whether you are just starting out or looking to refine your skills, mastering useState is crucial for building dynamic and interactive React applications. In this video, we are going to go through everything from basic use cases to advanced patterns. By the end, you'll have a solid understanding of how a useState works and when to use it effectively. Before we dive into the code, let's talk about what state is in React. State is essentially data that can change over time. It influences how your component looks and behaves. With useState, we can manage states directly within functional components, giving us a lot of flexibility. Unlike class components where you had to use this.state and this.setState to manage states, useState simplifies this process for functional components. So let us break down how this exactly works. Here, a very simple example. We have created a component called counter, which displays the number of times the button is clicked. We use useState to define the count variable initialized at 0. When the button is clicked, the setCount function is called, updating count and causing the component to re-render. It is important to note that every time you call setCount, React re-renders the component, which is why the UI updates to show the new value. Now let's take a closer look at the syntax. When we call useState, it returns two things, a state variable and an updater function. So in this case, count represents our current state and setCount is a function that allows us to update the value of count. These two values are destructured from the array returned by the useState. This design keeps the API simple and clean. The argument we pass to useState, here the number 0, is the initial state value. You can pass anything as the initial state, like a string, object, array, or even another hook. In some cases, you'll need to manage more than one piece of state in a single component. Luckily, you can call useState as many times as you need. In the user info component, we have two state variables, that is name and age. Each has its own set function and we can update them independently. So if we click the buttons, we'll either increment the age or change the user's name. Now, what if we need to store more complex data like an object? You can still use useState, but you'll need to take a care when updating the state. React doesn't merge state for when you're working with objects. So you need to manually spread the previous state when updating it. Here we are using the spread operator, that is the three dots and user, to copy the existing properties of the user object and then only updating the specific property we need to change. Without this, you would lose other properties when updating the state. Now let's talk about lazy initialization. Sometimes calculating the initial state is computationally expensive, like fetching or performing complex calculations. So instead of recalculating every time the component re-renders, you can pass a function to useState that only runs on the initial render. In this example, calculate initial value only runs once when the component is first mounted, thanks to lazy initialization. Every time we re-render the component, this function won't run again, which can significantly improve performance in complex apps. One thing you might not know is that you can also pass a function to set state. If your new state depends on the previous state, passing a function ensures that React gives you the most up-to-date state. Here, instead of directly using count, we can pass a function to set count that takes the previous value, that is prev count, and return a new one. This is especially useful when you have multiple state updates happening asynchronously. It is also important to know when not to use useState. If your state doesn't need to change, you don't need to manage it with useState. For example, if you're working with data that comes from props and doesn't require user interaction, you might not need state at all. Let's wrap things up by going over some best practices when working with useState. Firstly, it is better to split your state into multiple variables rather than managing everything in a single object, unless they are closely related. Then be conscious about how frequently you update the state. Frequent state changes can lead to performance issues, especially in larger applications. And finally, always use the functional form of useState when updating the new state depends on the previous state. So that was all about useState. So to wrap it up, useState is basically a hook that will trigger a re-render to the component on which depends on a specific variable. So whenever the value of that variable updates, the UI is re-rendered to make sure that the component is showing the most updated value. So I hope this video cleared things up for you. Make sure to like and subscribe.